An entire generation didn't wake up one day and decide to eat wrong. They followed charts on classroom walls, advice from doctors on television, labels approved by governments, and slogans repeated so often they stopped sounding like claims and started sounding like facts. Why was fat declared the enemy while sugar quietly slipped through the back door? Why did healthy become a marketing term instead of a medical one? Why were children taught simplified food rules that adults still obey decades later? And why, when the consequences appeared, was blame placed on personal discipline instead of the systems that wrote the rules? There's a second question hiding underneath all of this. If nutrition science was always evolving, why were its loudest conclusions treated as permanent truth? Today, we're opening the file on the strangest and most absurd experiments humanity has ever attempted. Not with chemicals, not with machines, but with food, something people put into their bodies every single day, trusting that the guidance surrounding it was honest, neutral, and designed for their well-being. These weren't lies whispered in secret. They were printed on packaging, taught in schools, and repeated by authorities with confidence. They survived not because they were correct, but because they were convenient. Fasten your seatbelts. Logic is about to die a spectacular death. Fact 1. When fat became public enemy number 1. The U.S. Senate Select Committee on Nutrition and Human Needs, chaired by George McGovern, officially framed dietary fat as the primary cause of heart disease, turning a disputed scientific theory into a national health directive repeated through schools, hospitals, and mainstream media. The guidance leaned heavily on Ansel Keys' lipid hypothesis, elevating selected population correlations while minimizing conflicting evidence, because policymakers needed a clear, scalable message that could be delivered without uncertainty or nuance. Federal agencies, medical associations, educators, and food manufacturers echoed the warning for decades, accelerating the rise of low-fat products loaded with sugar and refined carbohydrates under the credibility of official approval. Fat was not scientifically defeated. It was chosen as the villain because the system required one simple enemy people could follow without questioning. Fact 2. The food pyramid that looked like science. The U.S. Department of Agriculture introduced a standardized visual guide that taught Americans how to eat by arranging foods into neat, authoritative layers presented as objective nutrition science. Behind the design, agricultural policy, commodity surplus management, and industry lobbying shaped which food groups dominated the diagram, favoring grains and starches because they aligned with economic stability rather than metabolic evidence. Schools, textbooks, and public health campaigns treated the pyramid as settled truth, training generations to build meals around carbohydrate-heavy foundations while trusting the graphic's scientific appearance. The pyramid didn't educate bodies, it balanced political interests. Fact 3. Breakfast became a moral obligation. Food companies, medical spokespeople, and school programs collectively taught Americans that breakfast was the most important meal of the day, framing morning eating as a health requirement rather than a contextual choice. The message was amplified through cereal industry campaigns that blurred advertising with authority, presenting processed grains and sugar as responsible fuel for productivity and discipline. Children learned that skipping breakfast was unhealthy behavior, even when hunger cues were absent, while parents equated routine consumption with good parenting. Eating early stopped being nourishment. It became obedience. Fact 4. Calories replaced. Biology. Nutrition education in the United States simplified food into numerical calorie values, teaching the public that weight and health were governed by basic arithmetic rather than biological complexity. This reduction allowed institutions to promote a universal formula that ignored hormones, satiety signals, metabolic adaptation, and individual variation, because numbers were easier to communicate and regulate than physiology. Weight loss programs, medical advice, and food labels reinforced the idea that eating less always meant doing better, even as outcomes failed to improve. Math became a moral judge, standing in for biology. Fact 5. Sugar hid behind low-fat labels. Regulatory definitions allowed food manufacturers to market products as low-fat while remaining silent about sugar content, creating a powerful health halo around processed foods. To maintain taste and shelf life, companies replaced fat with sugar and refined starches, fully compliant with labeling rules that prioritized single nutrients over metabolic impact. Consumers believed they were making healthier choices, while unknowingly increasing sugar intake across daily meals and snacks. The label told the truth, just not the part that mattered. Fact 6. Cholesterol panic without context. Major medical organizations and public health authorities warned Americans that dietary cholesterol directly translated into heart disease, turning complex lipid science into a single, fear-based message repeated in clinics, newspapers, and food advice columns. To make guidance easy to remember and enforce, nuance about how cholesterol actually behaves in the body was removed, collapsing multiple mechanisms into one simple cause and effect narrative. Eggs, shellfish, and whole foods became dietary villains, while processed alternatives engineered to avoid cholesterol quietly gained legitimacy and market share. Fear proved easier to digest than complexity. Fact 7. One diet was supposed to fit everyone. National dietary guidelines were presented as universally applicable, implying that one set of nutritional rules could serve everybody equally. Cultural differences, genetic variation, metabolic diversity, and socioeconomic context were excluded, so policies could remain simple, standardized, and scalable across institutions. People followed the rules faithfully, failed to see expected health results, and blamed themselves rather than questioning advice never designed for individual reality. Uniform guidance produced uneven damage. Fact 8. Natural became a design choice. Food companies increasingly used words like natural, wholesome, and made with real ingredients to signal health without making measurable claims. Regulatory agencies allowed vague definitions that prioritized marketing freedom over nutritional clarity, letting branding replace substance. Consumers paid higher prices for reassurance while assuming these labels reflected safety and quality. Nature became a font style. Fact 9. Snacking was framed as stability. Food manufacturers, nutrition messaging, and workplace culture promoted frequent snacking as a way to maintain energy and stabilize blood sugar throughout the day. The advice conveniently aligned with the profitability of packaged foods designed for constant consumption rather than physiological need. Hunger cues weakened as people learned to eat by schedule instead of appetite, increasing dependence on processed snacks. The clock replaced the body. Fact 10. Health failure became a moral verdict. As nutrition advice failed to deliver promised outcomes, responsibility quietly shifted from institutions to individuals. Weight gain and illness were framed as evidence of poor discipline, weak character, or personal neglect, rather than systemic misinformation. Shame replaced trust. Guilt replaced understanding. And people internalized blame for following official guidance exactly as instructed. The lie survived by blaming the obedient. Fact 11. Sugar was treated as a neutral ingredient. Scientific institutions, industry-funded research groups, and public-facing nutrition authorities consistently framed sugar as a harmless source of energy rather than a metabolic stressor. Research emphasis and public messaging focused attention on fat and calories, allowing sugar to remain largely unchallenged in official dietary narratives. Food manufacturers expanded sugar use across breakfast foods, snacks, and beverages while benefiting from the absence of strong regulatory warnings. Sugar didn't need to be defended, it just needed to stay unnoticed. Fact 12. Fruit juice was marketed as fruit. Medical advice columns, pediatric guidance, and school programs promoted fruit juice as a healthy stand-in for whole fruit. The messaging ignored fiber loss and sugar concentration, reducing fruit to flavor and vitamins while stripping away context. Children consume sugar levels comparable to soft drinks under the assumption of medical approval. Liquid nutrition quietly rewrote expectations. Fact 13. Margarine replaced butter without a trial. Health authorities and food manufacturers promoted margarine as a heart-friendly alternative to butter. The substitution prioritized reducing saturated fat while overlooking the metabolic risks of industrial trans fats. Processed spreads entered households as responsible choices before long-term evidence was established. The replacement proved worse than the original. Fact 14. Fortification masked poor food quality. Food companies added vitamins and minerals to heavily processed products and marketed them as nutritionally improved. Regulatory frameworks allowed fortification to substitute for real food quality in public perception. Consumers believed nutrient addition equaled health, regardless of processing level. Nutrition became an overlay. Fact 15. Diet culture turned food into virtue. Media, advertising, and wellness culture framed food choices as moral decisions rather than practical ones. Eating clean became evidence of discipline, while deviation implied failure. Health outcomes suffered as guilt replaced curiosity and flexibility. Nutrition became a character test. Fact 16. Portion sizes were redefined without notice. Food manufacturers, restaurant chains, and public nutrition messaging gradually expanded what counted as a normal serving while keeping labels and advice unchanged. Packages, menus, and visual cues were adjusted, so larger portions felt standard rather than excessive, shifting perception without requiring explicit approval. People followed serving guidance faithfully, while unknowingly consuming far more than earlier generations ever had. The rules stayed the same, while the reference quietly moved. Fact 17. Exercise was framed as a calorie eraser. Fitness campaigns and weight loss messaging taught people that physical activity existed primarily to cancel out food choices. This framing reduced movement to punishment for eating rather than a health behavior with independent value. People exercised harder, ate differently, and still failed to achieve promised outcomes, internalizing blame when math didn't balance. Movement became debt repayment. Fact 18. Processed foods. Learned to borrow trust. Large food corporations partnered with health organizations, sponsored educational materials, and placed approval symbols on packaging. These associations transferred institutional credibility onto highly processed products without changing their underlying composition. Consumers trusted logos and endorsements more than ingredient lists, assuming legitimacy meant safety. Trust became an ingredient. Fact 19. Weight became the only visible metric. Medical settings, insurance frameworks, and public health campaigns focused heavily on body weight as the primary indicator of health. Other markers were sidelined because weight was easy to measure, record, and compare at scale. People chased numbers rather than well-being, often worsening health while meeting visible targets. Measurement replaced understanding. Fact 20. Confusion became the default outcome. As food advice shifted, contradicted itself, and layered new rules over old ones, clarity quietly disappeared. Institutions updated recommendations without addressing past guidance, leaving individuals to reconcile contradictions alone. People stopped expecting consistency and accepted confusion as normal. When no one can follow the rules, the system stops being questioned. Fact 21. Protein was treated as a secondary detail. Public nutrition messaging, school materials, and mainstream diet advice consistently downplayed protein in favor of carbohydrate-heavy balance models. The framing positioned protein as optional or excessive because it complicated simplified food rules designed for mass education. People structured meals around starches and sugars, while assuming protein needs would somehow take care of themselves. Muscle didn't disappear, priority did. Fact 22. Whole grains were marketed as a health upgrade. Food manufacturers rebranded refined products by adding minimal whole grain content and advertising them as nutritionally superior. Regulatory standards allowed these claims as long as certain thresholds were met, regardless of overall processing level. Consumers trusted packaging language and shifted purchases without meaningful metabolic change. Health became a percentage. Fact 23. Eating frequency replaced eating awareness. Diet advice promoted regular meals and snacks as discipline and stability. The structure ignored individual hunger signals in favor of schedule compliance. People learned to eat because it was time, not because their bodies asked. Routine overruled feedback. Fact 24. Medical advice was simplified for speed. Doctors, constrained by time and standardized guidelines, delivered short nutrition advice that favored memorability over accuracy. Complex metabolic realities were reduced to slogans that could fit into brief appointments. Patients followed guidance faithfully, while outcomes diverged. Efficiency replaced understanding. Fact 25. Food labels shifted responsibility to consumers. Packaging disclosures expanded, creating the impression of transparency. The volume of information made meaningful interpretation unrealistic for everyday shoppers. Responsibility shifted quietly from producers to individuals expected to decode fine print. Knowledge became a burden. Fact 26. Light foods borrowed the meaning of healthy food. Manufacturers widely used terms like light, diet, and reduced to signal health benefits without addressing overall nutritional quality. Regulatory language allowed these descriptors to reference a single modified attribute, often fat or calories, while ignoring sugar content, additives, and processing. Consumers trusted the shorthand, assuming less of one thing automatically meant better for the body. Health was reduced to a marketing adjective. Fact 27. Supplements replaced real nutrition. As dietary confusion increased, supplement companies positioned pills and powders as nutritional insurance. Marketing implied that deficiencies could be corrected without changing food quality or habits. People outsourced nutrition to capsules, believing balance could be swallowed rather than built. Food became optional when pills promised certainty. Fact 28. Diet trends were framed as scientific breakthroughs. Media outlets and wellness industries regularly presented new diets as revolutionary discoveries. Each trend simplified complex biology into rules that were easy to promote and monetize. People cycled through systems, blaming themselves when results faded, instead of questioning the cycle itself. Novelty replaced understanding. Fact 29. Children learned nutrition through packaging. Brightly colored boxes, mascots, and slogans taught children what food looked like long before labels were readable. Marketing normalized sugar-heavy products as breakfast, snacks, and rewards under playful authority. Taste preferences formed early, guided by branding rather than nourishment. Education began in the cereal aisle. Fact 30. Eating became an identity. Food choices gradually shifted from practical decisions to personal identity statements. Diet labels signaled values, discipline, and belonging rather than nutritional needs. People defended diets the way they defended beliefs, even when outcomes disappointed. Nutrition stopped being about eating and started being about who you were. Fact 31. Hunger was treated as a problem to eliminate. Public health messaging, workplace norms, and diet culture increasingly framed hunger as something to control, suppress, or outsmart. Snack products, meal replacements, and appetite management tools were marketed as solutions rather than questions. People learned to distrust hunger signals and rely on external rules, products, or schedules instead. Listening to the body was replaced by managing it. Fact 32. Children learned fear before understanding. School health programs and simplified nutrition lessons taught children which foods were good and which were bad, without context. The framing encouraged anxiety and rule following instead of curiosity and understanding. Children carried food guilt into adulthood, long after the original lessons lost relevance. Education planted fear where literacy should have grown. Fact 33. Eating out was framed as the exception. Diet advice consistently warned that restaurant food was dangerous or indulgent by default. This framing ignored social, cultural, and psychological aspects of eating in favor of control narratives. People oscillated between restriction and release, treating meals as moral events rather than nourishment. Food stopped being social and became strategic. Fact 34. Health messaging ignored. Stress and sleep nutrition advice isolated food from the rest of human life. Stress, sleep deprivation, and economic pressure were excluded because they complicated simple food rules. People changed diets without addressing the environments shaping their bodies. Food took the blame for everything else. Fact 35. The body became an optimization project. Wellness culture reframed health as an ongoing self-improvement task. Tracking, measuring, and optimizing replaced intuition and flexibility. People chased better without ever reaching enough. The project never ended. Fact 36. Healthy became a moving target. Public health messaging, food labels, and media advice repeatedly redefined what counted as healthy without fully retracting prior guidance. New rules layered over old ones, creating contradictions that favored flexibility for institutions but confusion for individuals. People chased updates instead of understanding principles, assuming the problem was their failure to keep up. Health turned into a moving goalpost. Fact 37. Weight loss was framed as the proof of health. Medical checkups, insurance metrics, and popular media treated weight loss as the clearest sign of success. Other improvements were dismissed if the scale did not change, reinforcing a single, visible outcome. People achieved temporary losses through restriction, while long-term health quietly declined. The scale became the judge. Fact 38. Eating clean replaced eating adequate. Wellness influencers and lifestyle media popularized the idea of clean eating as moral hygiene. Foods were divided into pure and impure categories without scientific clarity. People restricted variety and adequacy to preserve identity rather than health. Purity replaced nourishment. Fact 39. Conflicting experts were treated as personal failure. As experts disagreed publicly, institutions framed confusion as consumer responsibility. People were told to do their own research without tools to evaluate credibility. Mistrust grew, but individuals blamed themselves for not understanding. Chaos was outsourced. Fact 40. Nutrition advice lost its exit strategy. Guidelines changed, trends cycled, and corrections arrived without closure. No institution clearly admitted error or addressed long-term consequences of prior advice. People were left carrying the outcomes alone. The system moved on. Fact 41. Generational habits were mistaken for choice. Families passed down eating habits shaped by official advice, school programs, and media messaging without questioning their origin. Children inherited food rules as normal behavior rather than deliberate decisions, assuming these patterns reflected wisdom rather than policy. When health outcomes suffered, individuals blamed genetics or willpower instead of tracing habits back to their source. Tradition disguised instruction. Fact 42. Convenience was framed as progress. Food systems prioritized speed, shelf life, and portability as signs of modernization and efficiency. Highly processed foods were positioned as solutions for busy lives rather than compromises shaped by industrial limits. People traded time for quality while being told they were gaining freedom. Convenience quietly redefined necessity. Fact 43. Responsibility was individualized by design. Institutions promoted personal responsibility narratives around food choices. Structural factors like food deserts, pricing pressure, and marketing saturation were excluded from official discussions. People internalized failure while systems remained unexamined. Blame became efficient. Fact 44. Confusion was treated as a market opportunity. As dietary certainty collapsed, industries capitalized on uncertainty through books, programs, and products. Each solution promised clarity while adding another layer of contradiction. Consumers stayed trapped in cycles of hope and disappointment. Confusion became profitable. Fact 45. An entire generation learned to distrust its body. Years of conflicting guidance trained people to rely on external rules rather than internal signals. Hunger, fullness, and preference were treated as unreliable. People followed instructions instead of feedback. The body lost the vote. Fact 46. Eating became a lifelong correction loop. Nutrition advice was never presented as something that could end. Rules changed, trends rotated, and updates arrived without acknowledging the damage caused by previous guidance. People stayed locked in constant correction mode, assuming the problem was personal misunderstanding rather than shifting authority. Health stopped being a destination and became permanent adjustment. Fact 47. The system never audited itself. Institutions updated recommendations but rarely reviewed long-term outcomes of earlier advice. Mistakes were absorbed quietly while new narratives replaced old ones. Individuals carried consequences while systems moved forward unaccountable. Progress didn't require apologies. Fact 48. Success was redefined to avoid responsibility. As promised results failed to appear, success metrics quietly shifted. Weight loss became management, energy became balance, and outcomes were reframed to avoid clear failure. People were told improvement mattered more than results. Moving the goalposts solved the problem. Fact 49. Obedience was mistaken for discipline. Following rules exactly was framed as discipline and responsibility. Questioning guidance was treated as ignorance or denial. People learned compliance faster than understanding. Discipline replaced curiosity. Fact 50. The lie survived because it felt normal. None of these beliefs survived because they were hidden. They survived because they were repeated until they felt ordinary. An entire generation ate the way it was told and blamed itself when outcomes didn't match promises. The trick worked because it never felt like one. By now, the pattern should feel uncomfortably familiar. These food and nutrition rules didn't arrive as lies whispered in secret or schemes hidden behind locked doors. They arrived as charts in classrooms, advice from trusted doctors, labels stamped with authority, and slogans repeated so often they stopped sounding like claims and started sounding like facts. What we've seen isn't a collection of bad tips or outdated myths. It's a system that needed food advice to be simple, scalable, and controllable, even when the human body was none of those things. Complex biology was trimmed down to slogans. Uncertainty was replaced with confidence. And when results didn't match promises, responsibility quietly shifted away from institutions and onto individuals. Across decades, eating stopped being a response to hunger, culture, or context. It became a test of discipline, a reflection of character, a personal moral scorecard built on rules that kept changing without explanation. People didn't fail these guidelines. They followed them, faithfully, repeatedly, often at the cost of trust in their own bodies. The most absurd part isn't that advice evolved. Science is supposed to evolve. The absurdity is that evolution never came with accountability, closure, or acknowledgement of harm. Old rules faded without apology. New ones arrived without reconciliation. And the confusion left behind was treated as a personal problem. So far, what this file reveals isn't just misinformation. It's normalization. When guidance becomes routine, when contradictions feel ordinary, and when self-doubt replaces institutional doubt, the system no longer needs to convince anyone. It just needs them to keep eating, adjusting, and blaming themselves quietly. And that's how an entire generation didn't just learn what to eat, they learned to stop trusting themselves while doing it. Maybe the most damaging part of this story isn't that food advice was wrong. It's that it was delivered with certainty, enforced through authority, and never properly closed when it failed. Because what you've just seen wasn't chaos, it was order. An order built to make nutrition easy to teach, easy to regulate, and easy to scale, even if it was impossible to live by. Food became numbers because numbers are manageable. Labels replaced understanding because labels are enforceable. Guidelines stayed vague because vagueness protects institutions when outcomes don't arrive on schedule. And when the promised health never showed up, the system didn't collapse. It adapted. Failure was reframed as personal weakness. Confusion became individual responsibility. And obedience was praised as discipline, even when discipline produced the same disappointing results year after year. An entire generation didn't eat carelessly. They ate exactly as instructed. They trusted the charts, the experts, the packaging, and the slogans. And when their bodies didn't respond the way they were promised, they were told to try harder, restrict more, and blame themselves quietly. What makes this absurd isn't that science evolved. Science should evolve. What makes it absurd is that evolution happened without accountability. Old rules vanished without apology. New rules arrived without reconciliation. And the people living with the consequences were expected to adapt endlessly without asking why. At some point, eating stopped being about nourishment. It became a lifelong correction loop, a moving target where success was never clearly defined and failure was always personal. And maybe that's the clearest takeaway of all. Not that the food system lied, but that it taught people to distrust their own signals while trusting systems that never had to explain themselves. This has been the Absurdist Files, a place where logic doesn't disappear, it just gets buried under confidence. And if any of this felt familiar, frustrating, or quietly personal, that probably means you weren't fooled by one bad rule. You were trained by an entire system that never expected to be questioned.